Hey, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is Friday, May 28th, and I'm sitting down to do session number 2 of my 14-week online study regarding the book I co-authored with my good friend Suntan Ra, Unsettling Truths, the ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. We did our first session. I was hoping to do this every week, but we had some scheduling conflicts last week, and so I'm doing my second session this week, and we started by looking at the introduction of the book and making some comments in general about the book. And then today I'm going to go through chapter 1, which is the Doctrine of Discovery and Why It Matters. Before I begin, however, I want to do as I always do. Well, actually, let me start by introducing myself. So, Mark Charles Eunice, Simbake Dinan, the Tohigwini Bashichi, Simbake Dinan Dashachedo to the Cheatney Dashanala. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsimbake Dene. Loosely translated, it means I'm from the Wooden Shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsimbake Dene. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Tohichitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you today from what's now known as Washington, D.C., but these are the lands of the Piscataway. And I want to acknowledge the Piscataway people. I want to publicly state that they are still here. I want to acknowledge that they are the traditional peoples of these lands. They are the host people of these lands. And I want to publicly state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. I'm going to share this really quickly out on my Twitter account so that some other people can join us. So give me just a second to bring this up, and then we can get going here. Okay. You should be all set. So going into this session on chapter 1, and I'm going to share very quickly just a link here in the comments. If you'd like to buy a signed copy of this book, Unsettling Truths, I have them available on my website. And the book is still selling. It's been out for about a year and a half now. It came out in November of 2019, published by University Press, and it's still selling fairly well. I'm very pleased with how well it's selling. And but would love to get it into more hands. I really, really want this book to become a much more of a national dialogue, especially as we have these discussions we're having even today about critical race theory, as well as about Christian nationalism, and of course all the drama the Trump administration brought over the last 4 years, and the challenges that the Biden administration is presenting. And I think, as well as, of course, the racial violence, right? We just passed the 1-year anniversary of the lynching of George Floyd, and ongoing gun violence and violence against people of color throughout this country. And so this book and its content really work to get to the heart of what we're struggling with as a nation. And I am doing everything I can, including this 14-week study, to try and further this conversation. And one of the challenges is right, I have my social media. You've probably seen I've done some paid promotions of the book to try and expand the audience, but I'm really looking to find a way to get past kind of even my own platform and get it out even to more audiences around the country, so we can have some real discussion around it and really begin to build what George Erasmus would call a much better common memory for our country. Chapter 1, and I'll talk about some of these chapters. The way I want to do this study is, obviously we'll discuss the content of each chapter, but rather than just kind of reviewing what's written in the book, I want to talk and share a little about some of my own story and some of my own experiences of how we got to why we presented this even in the way we did, what sort of points we were trying to make, and how I was wrestling with this, and what I wanted to communicate. And so that's what I'm going to try and do today. And so this chapter it's not a very long chapter. It's actually one of the shorter chapters in the book. And it's introducing the doctrine of discovery. What is it, and why do we care about it? And I'll read briefly from chapter 1. And this will be on page, let me find it, page 15. I'm just going to read the paragraph where we introduce what the Doctrine of Discovery is. It says, the Doctrine of Discovery is a set of legal principles that govern the European colonizing powers, particularly regarding the administration of indigenous land. It is the primary legal precedent that still controls native affairs and rights and international law formulated in the 15th and 16th centuries. And that quote was taken from a book, and let me just give you the reference for that very quickly. We have all of our references and notes back. It's a book written by Professor Robert Miller, and his book is titled Discovering Indigenous Lands. And I have really enjoyed conversations I've had with Roberts and about his book and about his work, and I deeply appreciate what he's done. But from a theological perspective, the legal and political role of the Doctrine of Discovery is rooted in a dysfunctional theological imagination that shaped the European colonial settler worldview. The next paragraph says, the doctrine emerged as a series of 15th century papal bulls, which are official decrees by the Pope that carry the full weight of his ecclesial office. And then we go into the first of those papal bulls, which was written in 1452 by Pope Nicholas V, titled Dum Diversus. And one of in the first section of this chapter, what we try to do is go through several of these papal bulls. We look at Dum Diversus, we look at Romanus Pontifex, and we look at Inter Se Terra. And I'm not positive I'm pronouncing that right. But we look at these three papal bulls specifically and show how they kind of contributed to the building of this law that became known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And it was Dum Diversus that kind of justified and even established the role of slavery and enslavement. Romanus Pontifex talked about justifying discovery and the mistreatment of people based on discovery for the sake of their own salvation. And then Inter Se Terra was about really justifying what Columbus did. It was written in 1493 after Columbus had, quote unquote, discovered the New World, the North American continent. And it was basically kind of justifying what he had done and legalizing some of his actions and so on. One of the primary points we make about the Doctrine of Discovery is its dehumanizing worldview. Not only does it dehumanize people of color, African people, Native peoples, other indigenous peoples around the world, but it holds up as superior white European Christians. And this is using a word written in the 1300s, which was Saracens, which was in reference to the Moors or to the Muslims. Later it was applied to indigenous peoples in both Africa and North America. And Saracens was a term of other. It created an insider-outsider kind of worldview. And the use of this term, even in this first papal bull, all pagans and Saracens whatsoever, it's creating this category of other. And that is a big part of the worldview that is being perpetuated by the Doctrine of Discovery. It's not only that Native peoples, African people, people who aren't white European are less than, but it's also that European white Christians are greater than, are more than, are superior. And if you follow me online, you'll notice that frequently I will tweet out or post on my social media, white people are not superior. And I do that very intentionally. And part of it, it's because of this chapter. It's in part of the Doctrine of Discovery in this worldview where, yes, we have to acknowledge that Black lives matter. We have to acknowledge that Native lives matter. We have to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and all these people who have been made invisible in our world. But that's only part of the problem. The other part is that white people are not superior. And this is where we run into a problem as a nation, right? Because we are somewhat able to talk about our racism, which is our view of treating people as less than or as subhuman. But we rarely will talk about how our worldview and our cultural constructs and the Doctrine of Discovery set up white people to be superior. And we use language like white privilege, which, again, if you've heard me speak before, you see I don't use that term, because white privilege makes it sound like white people have been given a blessing that they just have to become better stewards of, instead of acknowledging that what they call privilege is actually the fruit of the oppression that they're standing on, and it doesn't need to be shared better, it needs to be confronted and even deconstructed. And so we have to get ourselves out of this mindset that white people have something that should be our envy, right? We should want what they call privilege. No, because what they have, the reason they have it is because they have built a society, they've constructed a worldview, they've written this doctrine of discovery that generates this oppression, which creates this fruit and benefits them. And if we're striving for it, it means we also want to achieve the fruits of that oppression. And so, yes, we need to acknowledge the humanity of people of color, but we also need to frequently state white people are not superior, because that's the second half of the lie. And this is where that term, that category of other, the Saracens, pagans, the savages, this is where those terms kind of do both of those roles, right? It dehumanizes one and it elevates the other. And we need to get better at confronting that. And we see this at play even in our modern world, right? Whether it's on social media, or meetings that we're a part of, or even when we watch our politicians. I mean, why is it so easy to mistreat people online? Because we don't see them, right? Why is it so easy to get into a screaming match and call people horrible things and post hurtful things on social media? Why? Because we're not seeing people as peers, as humans. They've been reduced to characters in a tweet, or to a meme, or to a graphic on a page, or something else, anything but human. And so if we forget that, that's when we tend to say things we don't want to say, or degrade people in ways we would never degrade them in person. It becomes so easy when we do that online. I remember when I was serving on the board of a Christian organization, and we were having a discussion about LGBTQIA2S+, and about how our organization was going to interact with that community. This was a conservative organization, and they were wrestling with. They brought me onto the board to try and bring in some outside perspectives, and they were wrestling with how are we going to engage with this community when we have this long history of conservative patterns. And at one point we were looking at a study about the LGBTQIA2S+ and attitudes within the organization. And when the discussion about that report came up, I sat back and kind of observed how the conversation was taking place. And it was literally within a few minutes that people began using language of other. Those people, that group. And it fascinated me, right? Because this is what I experienced as a Native man all my life, of people treating us as other. And when I saw our language go into using in our meeting of using this language of other, it was after maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 minutes, I finally stood up and I said, we need to stop, and can you listen to yourselves and what you're saying? I said, it took just a few moments for the conversation to degrade itself into using this language of other. And the problem is once we use language of other, then we are no longer under an obligation to treat people as human. If we consider them less than, now we don't have to treat them as equal or as human, and we can justify mistreatment of them. Right? And that same issue, we saw that even in conservative circles during the presidencies. It was George Bush, a very conservative president, and his vice president, Dick Cheney, who was his pit bull on almost every single issue, right? He was one of the most powerful vice presidents our nation's seen in a long time, and he was George Bush's pit bull on so many issues, except for one. That issue was what? It was gay marriage. Why did Dick Cheney not go out in the forefront? Why did he not clear the way? Why did he not play that role for President Bush on the issue of gay marriage? Well, because he and President Bush fundamentally disagreed. Why did they disagree? Well, because Dick Cheney's daughter is gay. She's lesbian. And so while George Bush had lived in this world, this conservative world, this bubble that rarely allowed him or led him to interact with people different from himself, and so he could justify and say, well, we're not going to give this group of other the same rights and privileges that the rest of us enjoy. That group, and I would imagine Dick Cheney grew up in a very similar bubble, but when that bubble burst because of his daughter, suddenly that community, which he had probably dismissed most of his life, suddenly became very, very, very human to him. And he couldn't justify treating them the same way the president he was serving at the pleasure of wanted to treat them. And so he broke from George Bush very strongly on that issue. And this is, right, we see this all the time. I remember when I moved back to the Navajo Nation, that was one of the first things, you've heard me say this before. When we moved to the reservation, I described, we moved into this hogan 6 miles off near Cave Road on a dirt road, no running water, no electricity, lived in a one-room hogan. Our neighbors were rug weavers and shepherds. And the first thing I learned was how incredibly isolated it was out there. It literally felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. I was astounded at how few white people we ever saw on the reservation, and I quickly observed the only white people we saw were those who came to give us charity or those who came to take our picture. Nobody wanted to sit and talk with us. No one wanted to even just get to know us. In fact, I wrote a blog article when I was really wrestling with this early. I published this back in 2010 when I was reflecting on this after that experience of living there. And I'm going to put it in the comment section because it's just very important to understanding even what my thinking was and what I was wrestling with, which is the only people outside of our community we ever saw were those who came and either saw us as their focus of their charity, or they were there to study us and take pictures of us and have this exotic experience. No one just wanted to sit down and have a cup of coffee, just talk and get to know us as people. We were always someone's project, whether it was a charitable project or an educational project. We were always a token. We were never just a neighbor. And that was one of the hardest things to get over. It was during that time, I would tell people a lot, especially growing up in high school and even in college, rarely did I feel inferior because I was Native. That was never my first guess if I didn't get something I wanted or something going away. I never thought, oh, this is happening because I'm Native. I didn't feel that. But when I moved to the reservation and I lived on the reservation, And I saw how intensely that mentality was being demonstrated to my community. I actually really began to struggle with some pretty deep insecurity. And it was actually about that time when I wrote this article, and the event I was describing in that article was when I was deeply struggling with, I was feeling insecure and I didn't know why. I described in there an interaction where I was at a gym because I had to go into town because we were not running water, and I had meetings with a client that I was doing some work for. And so we would have to take showers at gyms in the city, in Gallup. And this was a common practice among our community. And so a lot of the businesses that the gyms and other, even some other places, would allow us to come in, and for a small fee, we could take a shower there. And I remember I was in that locker room, and I had taken my shower, I was getting dressed, and some men walked in, they weren't native. And I immediately felt judged. And I began to think very defensively. I wonder, I was doing some computer programming at the time. I had graduated from UCLA, maybe 10 years earlier. And I remember sitting there thinking, I wonder if these men know I probably have an education from a better school than they do. I wonder if they know that I probably earn a higher hourly rate than they do. And I remember thinking these thoughts, trying to wrestle with my own insecurities. And I didn't talk to them, and they didn't talk to me. And when they left, I sat there and I just thought, where did those thoughts come from? I never had felt the need to kind of justify myself that way, or to prop myself up in that way. And I'm like, where is that insecurity coming from? I was really wrestling with it at that time. And it was because we were so overlooked. We were so marginalized. And it's not even necessarily that we were mistreated as much as we were just flatly ignored. And that was one of the hardest things about living on the reservation and living in the Hogan. Was, I said before, I felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. Like nobody knew about us except when they wanted to give charity or take our pictures. No one cared. We weren't included in the dialogues. Our opinion wasn't sought. Our input wasn't valued. And that's when I really began wrestling with not only my own insecurity, but this feeling of being devalued, dehumanized. And what did it mean? It was at that same time that I began using this other analogy or meta that I use frequently about what it feels like to be Native American and living in the United States. This image of this grandmother in the house. I'm going to share that now too. And I remember the first time I wrote that down, I was trying to help some friends of mine understand how it felt to live on the reservation. And I was, the 10th time, trying to get them to understand this. I was writing a letter, and in my letter to them, I wrote out that image that I described in the video. Being Native American feels like you're an old grandmother who has a very large and very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into your house and they violently locked you upstairs in the bedroom. Today, your house is full of people. They're sitting on your furniture. They're eating your food. They're having a party inside your house. Even though they've unlocked the door to your bedroom. So you could come out, but it's much later. You're tired, you're old, you're weak, you're sick. So rarely do you come out. But the thing that hurts the most, that causes the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party comes upstairs. Seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her in the bed, takes her hand, and just simply says, thank you. I wrote that. That's it. That's how I feel. My friends, as I shared that, instead of defending themselves, justifying themselves, They would ask questions. How do you say thank you? What does it look like to approach the grandmother? Which led to an entirely different conversation. A conversation that allowed me to participate not as a token educator or a target of charity, but as a peer. Someone who even has a role. And I've used that analogy around the world to help initiate dialogue between indigenous peoples and their colonizers. It's one of the better tools I've found to begin that conversation, begin that discussion, because what it does is it humanizes. Not only in the eyes of the majority does it humanize the indigenous or the marginalized community, but in our own eyes, it humanizes us. That's the big struggle, right? And that's the problem with the doctrine of discovery. That's the problem with the worldview, this dysfunctional theological worldview that's we're describing in this chapter, is we have this dehumanizing worldview that not only does it oppress and dehumanize people of color and those on the margins, but it sets up as superior those who are white, European, and Christian. And yes, we have to lift up the people from the margins. We also have to bring down the people who think they're above human status. This is why I talk so frequently about decentering whiteness. I tell people, a lot of white people especially, get very afraid when I start talking the way I talk. Why do you always point out white landowning men? Because you wrote your frickin' foundations to center white landowning men. I have to talk about it because that's what's in the middle of this. Well, then we're going to be afraid. We're going to be the marginalized and you're going to mistreat us. I don't want to mistreat you. But I also don't want to treat you as superior or as privileged or as somehow being in the enviable position. I want to treat you as human. Now, when you're used to being treated as superior, as God, being treated as human is going to feel oppressive. It's not, but it's going to feel that way. I can't help that. I can tell you why it's going to feel difficult, but that you still need to be treated that way. And this is the challenge with addressing the doctrine of discovery. And this is why one of the reasons I think this book is so challenging is because we're not necessarily describing something that's abstract. Like we're not describing something that the reader is being brought into a new world. We're actually helping the reader understand a world they already live in. And so we're articulating things that they may already have an idea that what they're experiencing, how they're living, what their worldview is amiss. It's not fully right, but they don't fully understand why. And when we describe it for people, that is what makes this book so unsettling. Because once you see it, you can't ignore it, right? Once it's there, once it's pointed out, you can't unsee it. And so this is where, in the book we talk about how dum diversus was used to justify the enslavement of those from Africa. So much so, and elevate white European Christians, so much that even the white European Christians were able to come and offer enslaved boys as a tithe to the church. Right? That's how dysfunctional this theological worldview has become. The same thing with the discovery of North America, right? As the first sentence of this chapter, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. That may sound obvious, but that's not what you've been taught. That's not what you were taught all through K through 12 and probably in college. That's not what your politicians have said to you for almost the majority of your life. You've been told these lands were discovered. There was a survey someone pointed out online a few days ago. I saw a survey from the Bismarck Tribune, and it was a survey done back in 2018 about attitudes towards Native peoples. And I'll share the link online. Let me get it here. But it found that 40% of the people surveyed didn't think Native Americans still existed. Actually, I should say don't think Native Americans still exist. Think about that. 40% of the people surveyed didn't know or don't believe Native Americans still exist. They think we're only in the history books. Majority of people do believe, they go on to state that majority of people do believe that, yeah, what was enacted against us was genocide. But I want to just read a few things from this article. It's titled, Where Are Native Americans? For many, American tribes are regulated to history books. A recent survey found 40% of respondents didn't think Native Americans still exist. The Reclaiming Native Truth Project aimed to figure out what the dominant narrative is about Native peoples. So what are people saying about Native Americans? How are they represented in culture and media? And crucially, how does that translate into public policy and opinion? The complete lack of representation in the media, in pop culture, in K through 12 education, not only erases us from the American consciousness, it inadvertently creates a bias, consultant Echo Hawk told Women's Media Center. People were less likely to support certain rights and social justice issues for Native peoples when they had zero perception and understanding of who we are. Invisibility and erasure is the modern form of racism against Native peoples. 63% of people surveyed support doing more for Native Americans, while 5% argue for doing less. Right? I put that in there because that's fascinating. 40% of those surveyed didn't think we even existed anymore. Yet 63% thought more should be done for us. That's just how out of touch this stuff is. The article went on to say most people, from elected officials to the media to the general public, didn't understand tribal sovereignty. Most lumped all Native Americans into one group instead of recognizing tribal differences. The survey also showed college-educated people of color, people who know Native Americans, and people in the Northeast, liberals and young women are more likely to support Native Americans. White people living in Indian country, seniors, conservatives, and older men without a college degree were considered to be the toughest to convince to be allies. It's fascinating, right? That people who live in Indian country, near or around our reservation, were the hardest to convince that more needed to be done for Native American rights. Probably because they saw in those contrasts that giving us more rights would hurt them. While the people in the Northeast, where the erasure has taken the most effect, the genocide was the most thorough. People in the Northeast, where it's been the most thorough. Right, this is probably where the majority of the 40% who don't even think we exist are living. And yeah, this is so. The whole point of all this is this notion that America, and we saw this even with Rick Santorum a few weeks ago, that this country was founded on a blank slate. There were no people here. There was no injustice enacted to claim these lands. There was nothing present. It was built out of a chasm. right? This is the challenge we face as a nation, and that is directly the result of the doctrine of discovery. That is directly the result of this dehumanizing worldview that doesn't see us and doesn't want to see us. And so those are some of the deeper themes we're trying to do in this chapter. Yes, we're trying to lay out what the doctrine is and how it's been embedded, but one of the most important things that I hope people get out of that chapter is how the doctrine dehumanizes the people from the margin and elevates the white European Christians. And this is why we need to confront both of those things. Yes, we need to say Black Lives Matter. Yes, we need to say Native Lives Matter. We also need to repeat over and over and over again, white people are not superior. Because if we just elevate the people from the margins up to human status, and we still leave white people up in the divine status, we're not going to solve the problem. I don't want to live up here. White people don't have what I want. I don't want the fruits of the injustice like they are benefiting from. We need to decenter them, bring them down, so everyone can have a peer-to-peer, eye-to-eye dialogue and conversation, figure out how do we move forward. This is why creating common memory is so important. This is why teaching our history is so important. And this is why, something I tweeted out earlier today, this is why even as we deal with issues like white nationalism, right? White nationalism is becoming a very hot button topic, just like critical race theory is a hot button topic right now. Everyone's screaming about these things. But no one's connecting these things to these issues, right? White nationalism, this is what the Doctrine of Discovery is. It's Christian nationalism. This is how this nation was founded. The Promised Land, Manifest Destiny, the Doctrine of Discovery. If you're critiquing Christian nationalism and you are not including a discussion, a central discussion on the Doctrine of Discovery, because you're not doing your homework. Right? Why is critical race theory such a huge issue right now? One of the major things critical race theory does is it centers the voices of the people from the margin. It centers our voices. This is why the country is screaming about it. Because you can't maintain a mythology when you allow the people who are not supposed to exist to speak. You want to know why CRT is causing so much havoc? That's why. Because if we allow the people from the margins to speak, if we allow us to contribute books like this into the national discussion, it doesn't allow the mythology to continue. This is why you'll notice that even books about the same content as Sunshine and I wrote about, as other people have written about, books by white authors on the same topics will sell so much better, even though they say many of the same things. Why is that? Because if it's written by a white person, it allows the dialogue to remain academic, and it allows the mythology to remain. When you actually allow the voices from the margins, the people who have been marginalized, the people who have been erased, when you actually allow us to speak, the virtue of letting us speak, just by virtue of letting us speak, you're destroying the myth. And the whole system is about perpetuating the myth. So those are some thoughts I just wanted to lay out about chapter 1. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask about this chapter, I welcome you to put them into the comment section of whatever social media you're watching on, either YouTube or Facebook. It will come across my screen. Put it as question first. So I'll give you an example. Type it like this. I just gave you a small example. So mark it with question like that, and then write your question after the colon. That will just help us identify them in the comments a little bit quicker. But if you have any questions about chapter 1, we have about maybe 10 minutes left before we reach, actually about 20 minutes left before we reach about an hour of this live stream. And I'm happy to try and take a few moments to answer a few questions. I hope this is a helpful format to do this study. I want to find a way to make it a bit more interactive. I have a hard time following the comments when I'm just speaking, but I do have Mr. Phil Fox, who is helping me moderate some of these live streams, and so he helps me sort through some of the questions and comments that are coming across. So if you see him a lot on the live streams, it's because he has generously offered his time to help moderate this, and I really appreciate your partnership with this, Phil. But does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask about this? Can wait a few minutes to see what does come in. Again, my goal is to do these once a week. I'm slowly trying to get into a pattern of doing these. And my goal would be to do it every Friday around this time, somewhere between 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. I found this is a pretty good time in the afternoon to get people together online. Question asked by Stephanie said, what will it take to revoke the Doctrine of Discovery? So that's a good question, Stephanie, because there's a lot of denominations that have tried to rescind the Doctrine of Discovery. And one of the examples I point out in my book is this story where I was at Standing Rock. And there have been several denominations that have repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery. But they wanted to do that in a more symbolic way and not in an actual way. So again, the Doctrine of Discovery is a set of legal principles or governing principles that have been embedded into the foundations of our country. So you can see its influence on our Declaration of Independence, on our Constitution. You see it most clearly in land titles, where discovery is the legal precedent for land titles. And so there's a lot of Christian denominations that want to repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery and say this is an evil doctrine, it's heretical, we don't want to live by it anymore. And this had happened at Standing Rock, where several members of different denominations, leaders and members of the denomination came forward and read their denomination's repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery. I wasn't at that event, but I was there a few weeks later, and I was talking to someone who helped organize it. And I asked them if when they read those statements, did they return any land, right? Because denominations hold a lot of land. I'm assuming some of it, if not all of it, is native land. And they said, no one returned any land. And I can understand that because it probably took a while to bring that together. It would take a while to bring that together, and this event probably happened pretty quickly. I said, but it's the legal precedent for land titles. So when they read the repudiations, did they state that should a tribe ever sue them for their land, that they would not defend themselves in court? Because again, if they defend themselves, their only defense, because whatever treaty that may have been written over that land has since been broken by the U.S., so their only defense as to why they still have a right to it would be the Doctrine of Discovery. And so I asked him, did any group who read their statements of repudiation commit that if they ever got sued for their land, they would not defend themselves because they would now be relying on this document that they've repudiated? He said, no one did that either. And I said, oh, this was just a photo op then, right? I mean, nothing changed. It was just photo op. And that's the challenge. And this is why the doctrine of discovery is so hard, right? Because it literally sets up land titles. And if you think issues like Social Security and our things are the third rail of U.S. politics, try land titles. Like, no one wants to wrestle with land titles. And this is one of the reasons I proposed this national dialogue on race, gender, and class, a national truth and conciliation commission. And this is why I'm adamant that discussion can't just deal with our history of enslavement and even reparations. Yes, we have to deal with that, but we also have to deal with land titles. It was in 2005, if you watch my TEDx video, We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in U.S. history. It was in 2005 that Ruth Bader Ginsburg still references the Doctrine of Discovery in her Supreme Court opinion, stating natives do not have sovereignty to their own land. And so, if we're ever going to be a nation where we the people means all the people, we absolutely have to find a new way to understand land titles and even to deal with treaties. And so when you ask, how do you repudiate these things? Well, there's no formal body, right? There's a lot of people doing different efforts, and there's some people who are trying to take this to the Vatican. There's other people who are trying to deal with this in the court of law. I've decided to do neither of those. I do not believe even Pope Francis has the courage to wrestle with the doctrine of discovery. He's demonstrated that. U.S. law is never going to deal with it, right? The foundation, the Supreme Court ruled last summer, McGirt versus Oklahoma, that any time the U.S. Congress can muster the will, they have the right to break treaties and agreements with Native nations, and there's no consequence. The Supreme Court ruled that. And so the court system is not going to fix this problem. This is literally why I'm calling for this national dialogue, and this is why I'm running for president. I ran for president in 2020. Is because I don't want to bring this up to Pope Francis as someone protesting. I would love to sit down with Pope Francis as the president of the United States and say, guess what? We're going to have a discussion about land titles and about this doctrine of discovery. I would love to sit down with Queen Elizabeth and the Prime Minister of most of our NATO nations, NATO allies. Say, we're going to have a conversation about this doctrine of discovery and what you've done with it and how you've benefited from it and how it still remains a deep part of our colonial bond together, even as nations. We have to fix it. I think that will give a better result than just protesting and hoping they do the right thing, because I have very little hope that they will deal with land titles in that way. Phil is texting me here. Let me see what he's saying here. Someone's asking, how do we get public schools to finally teach a better history than the one-sided history of colonialism that was taught in the 70s? It wasn't until I started following you for a while now that I finally learned a different history. Thank you, Mark. This is from someone named Steve. Yeah, so I hope I answered that first question about repudiation or revoking it. That was a very good question. This question from Steve, right, this is the other challenge, where what gets taught in our schools is, I mean, most of our textbooks are printed in states like Oklahoma and Texas that literally have laws. Not only are they pushing back the hardest against centering the voices of people from the margins, critical race theory, and using those to influence our textbooks, but they literally have laws stating you can't use certain words, you can't talk about slavery, you can't even have a negative impact or a negative reflection of U.S. history. And so, again, there are people, I think, and I know there are people working hard to engage this academically. We need to engage it. I have chosen not to make that my forefront. I mean, I did write this book, and I want to get this alternate history out there. Even earlier today, I tweeted something where I said, consider this book, Unsettling Truths, to be a paint remover for the layers of mythology and propaganda that we teach in our schools about American history, K through 12. Right? We need this type of a paint remover. We need something to begin to deconstruct that history. But right, this is the challenge, and I think this is where some of these disagreements are going to become even more centered. Right? As the white majority becomes the white minority, and as they find themselves decreasing in their numbers, and people from the margins increasing in numbers over the next few years and even decade or so, I think we're going to see white America use these slicks, these advantages they wrote into their foundations. So even though they lose their majority, they will still try to hold on to power, whether it's through education, whether it's through policy, whether it's through how they govern, right, voting and stuff like that. And this is one of the reasons why I was so adamant when I ran in 2020 that we need to change our foundations. Because when we have foundations that were written to center and to protect white landowning men, as that demographic becomes a smaller percentage of our population, you better absolutely believe that they're going to use those foundations to try to maintain power and control. And so this is why I'm there's a lot of talk that change comes from the bottom, and I agree. I'm not against, change coming from the grassroots. But because of the way our foundations were written, I think until we change the foundations, what we do at the grassroots is not going to have as much of an impact, which is one of the reasons why I ran for president in 2020. Now, we still need to have people working at the grassroots. We still absolutely need people engaging these things at the educational level, at the grassroots level. But because they're written into the foundations, and I should probably grassroots would be up here and foundations would be down here, but because they're written into the foundations, if we don't change those foundations, if we don't address it there, the ability, our ability to change things through the grassroots is going to be severely limited. And so I would love to see them even work in partnership or even happen simultaneously. And so I do not want to hinder anybody who is working to change the way our textbooks are written or to change the way that we deal with different policies. This is why I applaud anyone who's willing to step in and engage these things. And then I am choosing to invest a lot of my energies to try to address it at a foundational level. And I hope people can see that we're not working against one another. But I deeply believe they both need to be changed if we want the change to be sustained. I hope that's helpful. Thank you for asking that question, Steve. Let's see if we have any more. Someone's asking, are you open for audience members to request that you be featured on other platforms and social media, such as podcasts, YouTube channels, Twitch? Yes, absolutely. I'm in the process of trying to revamp our website, and that's one of the things I want to do once we get some of my website revamped, is to actually create a page where if you want to suggest me for a podcast, for an interview, for a media outlet or whatever, by all means, I'm more than willing to try to engage this. I am doing everything I can in the next year and a half to try to expand the audience and the platform. I would love to see more people read this book. I would love to have more people engaging with this and wrestling with this content. I would love to see this conversation expanded. And so if you know of agencies or you have connections to news agencies or podcasts or people who do interviews and are writing articles, please feel free to give them my name. The best way to reach me right now is, let me pull up this link that I have. It's on my website. There's a contact, and it's a speaker request form. And it's not as thorough as I would like. One of the reasons why we're redoing the page. But let me share this link. It's a speaker request form, and we can use it kind of generically, where you can just submit a request and even include interview requests in there, and it will go to myself. I'll see it as well as my assistant will see it, and so it's a good way to kind of get in contact with us. So I just put the link to the speaker request form onto my website, or onto the comment section here, and you can, by all means, feel free to reach out to me there. You can also reach out to me on social media. That's kind of hit and miss. I don't catch everything. I try to watch my social media pretty closely, but I don't catch everything. And so through that speaker request form is one of the best ways to get information to me. Let me see if we're almost out of time here. Let me see if we have any other questions. Someone asks, what do you suggest natives do in order to break through and become better known without assimilating in the same system that has repeatedly done us wrong, if we have to? I love that question. That's what I've been trying to figure out, right? Is how do we do this without just becoming part of the system? You know, one of the challenges, and this is one of the reasons why I ran as a candidate in 2020 as an independent, because I've watched the two-party system very closely for the past decade, and I realized both parties are all about maintaining the status quo. Both of them are steeped in racism, sexism, and white supremacy, and they center absolutely the voice and the opinions of white landowning men. The Democrats are just as bad, if not even worse, than the Republicans are in that regard. They give the appearance of giving a greater presence and nod to marginalized peoples and people of color, but they also are more blatant in then flat out ignoring those voices. And so, right, this is where one of the things I've talked about is the myth of American exceptionalism is the coping mechanism for a nation in deep denial of its racist, sexist, and white supremacist past, as well as its current racist reality. And the reason I say that so often is, if you want to gain voice and platform, you have to learn how to affirm American exceptionalism. That's what media looks for, that's what politicians look for, that's what donors look for, that's what voters look for, right? These white landowning men who run everything, they absolutely want to see their myth of their exceptionalism reaffirmed. And so if you want to go against that, that's a challenge, because you're going to lose access to a lot of those avenues. And one of the things that I've been focusing most of my time and energy on is to build even my own platform through my own social media. So I began blogging. As you saw, I posted a blog from 2010. I began blogging almost 12 years ago. I think it was 2008 was probably when I first started blogging. And I've been working very hard to kind of build my audience. And I've been trying to be strategic about that, where I haven't tried to monetize my audience. I just was dismayed to see that YouTube now has claimed the right to add advertising to any of the videos on their on their YouTube channels, on YouTube channels. And so I'm seeing advertising appear on my YouTube channel, even though I chose not to monetize it. But I have been very careful not to grow my audience, A, through trying to monetize it, or B, through trying to just create tension or chaos, right? Which is another way to get attention. And I've tried to build an audience by live streaming the sunrise and sharing reflective thoughts on issues, and to really allow my own voice to be heard. And I've also worked very hard to not put myself in a position where I have to parrot American exceptionalism or buy into those myths that we perpetuate as a nation, which means I've had to choose out of a lot of opportunities that would have maybe given me more platform, but would have made me change my message. And the problem is, right, every time you change your message to gain platform, eventually you find yourself with a pretty large platform, but your message is nowhere what you ever wanted it to be. And so I've chosen the path of trying to grow my platform gradually. And I could have done a lot more things to grab more attention earlier. I chose not to do those things. I could have tried to monetize it and chose not to do that. I could have allowed myself to kind of be swept up by these larger institutions and got their promotion, but that would have changed my voice. And so I've been trying to just grow mine gradually. And now I'm really wrestling with what do we do, because again, while I have a platform, it's not a part of the national dialogue. And I think one of the things I even realized coming out of the 2020 election is the institution, media, is willing to give platform even to Native peoples when we offer wisdom or even perspective. But they're much less likely to do it when we actually want to lead. So if we want to protest something, if we want to point out an injustice about something, we may have a better chance of getting platform that way. But the moment we try to actually step into and propose ideas for leadership and step into a role as a leader, that platform will quickly be taken away. And again, because that's the threat, right? Even going back to the reservation, where we are either the folks of the charity, or they want to take our picture and give us charity. No one wanted to come and just sit down with us as people. So when we actually come in and step in and try to lead, that's where it's much harder. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's much harder to get platform, especially in the mainstream in that way. And this is some of my own journey for this. So I don't know if there's any silver bullet way to do this, right? There's no, I think there's a lot of people who are going different routes, right? Deb Haaland has gained significant platform by running for office as a Democrat. And I applaud her. I'm grateful for the work she's been able to do. I've also been very disappointed in the way Joe Biden has required her to mute some of the strongest parts of some of her message in order to fall in line with his platform. Right? She had to walk back her statements on drilling and on oil pipelines during her confirmation hearing, because they were in contrast, not to what the Republicans wanted, they were in contrast to that, but mostly they were in contrast with what Joe Biden wanted. So she had to walk back all those statements to fall in line with Joe Biden. And so I was very disappointed in Joe Biden that he basically forced the first Native American Secretary of the Interior to mute her voice in some very key issues in regard to Native sovereignty, because they didn't fall in line with his policies, platforms, and proposals. So that, again, that's the problem, is yes, she has a great platform, but she's not able to say everything she wants to say right now because they are in contrast to the person she's serving as president. So and I'm not saying she's wrong to do what she's doing, but these are choices we make, and these are things that we're trying to address. And so I'm trying to take the route of, I want to see if I can actually, my goal in running in 2020 was, can we actually get into the dialogue without clinging on to the shirt tails of a white landowning male, and actually present our own ideas and proposals for leadership and see where we get with that. Now, I was pretty naive in a lot of things I did in 2020, and I had a lot to learn. I'm trying to become wiser and better, and if I do decide to run again, I expect I'll be able to do it much better and hopefully more effectively. Those are the things I'm looking at for the future. But yeah, I love your question. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's a great thing to think about, and it's a great thing to experiment with and find out what are the things you're willing to give and take so that you can accomplish your goal. And that's going to be the challenge going all the way through that whole process. So thanks for asking that question. I appreciate it. It is about an hour that we've been going on this, and so I don't want to make this too long, but I appreciate everybody's questions. For those who have submitted questions, I will make sure we get them out of the chat and find some time to answer as many of them as possible in the future, whether it's through another live stream or something online. I'm not sure what yet, but I appreciate all of your questions. Thank you for joining in this live stream today. We will do this again, hopefully next week, Friday, same time or not same time, but sometime in the afternoon. And I look forward to having more engagement with you. Please consider purchasing a book, Unsettling Truths. We're going to be going through this over the next 3 months. And I want to do everything I can to continue to grow the audience of this book so that it really does become a part of the national dialogue. I can't have my relatives. I hope that you have a great weekend. I hope that you have a safe weekend. It's Memorial Day this weekend. Please make sure that you're protecting your own health and the health of those in your family and in your community. And if you're traveling, please make sure that you're safe. Walk in beauty, my relatives. And then we learn how to walk in beauty together. And Hakonet.